Yeah. So answer the question regarding legislation. So the legal and political context for the countries that are here represented are so different. You know, Indonesia with both. Indonesia has an FOI law, Nepal has, Philippines no, Hong Kong no, open data policy. There's a certain degree of open data policy. There's no open data policy in Indonesia, none in Nepal. In the Philippines, a little bit, yes, because it's enshrined in the General Operations Act of 2015. And in Hong Kong, their context is some kind of. So there are differences in how the legislations are actually being formatted and implemented, as well as there are differences also on how these legislations are actually monitored at the level in these governments. Okay, so as to the question of use, for FOI in both Nepal, so Nepal and Indonesia, the kind of requests for information are actually coming from civil society groups. Users are mainly from interested groups, CSOs, and not necessarily citizens. They still have to go into that direction. And in the case of Nepal, much of the data that were requested are actually entitlement-related information. Like how many scholarships are there, how can people actually take advantage of this, and where can they get it, and what's the process, and who are given actually. And in the case also of Indonesia, the kinds of information that are requested by CSOs are related essentially to budgets, political financing, environmental impact assessments, and several things that are related about money. And certain public services. Okay. And we skipped the measurements part because we didn't have time. So we actually prioritize the questions, and we find question 4 to be more interesting. And as to the groups that the discussion actually. There are differences in context. So in the Philippines, for example, when there's no FOI law, the FOI advocates are actually telling the open data community, you're hijacking the FOI agenda. Because like governments are actually saying,
familiar to I think.
So governments are actually saying, so there is already open data, there's a portal and so on, so you can get information from there. But of course, it's not complete. Out of the total 200 agencies, you only have like 6 agencies that are actually disclosing data in the portal and in the open formats. So in Indonesia, they're actually, both communities are actually moving in different directions. One is doing the transparency track, and the other is more about public service delivery, efficiency, etc. And then they're saying that there's a big opportunity for them to be able to do collaboration. And one of the suggested methods was to sit down together, both communities, define priorities and interests, and look for nodes where those priorities and interests actually intersect, and work from there. So that hasn't happened yet. Probably they'll do that right after this conference. Okay, so and
sorry.
And then there's I think what actually transpired out of in the case of Nepal, for example, it's a different context as well. By the way, there's no open data portal in Nepal. So the open data portal is actually run by a CSO, which is composed of both FOI advocates and open data communities. So the merger of interests is actually the one that actually binds together and glues together these two different communities. And I think that's a lesson that we'll have to take with us at the end.
Okay, sorry. Okay, just one.
Yeah, very little from me. In terms of collaborations, the two groups can get together when they can use certain momentum. For example, in the country, when the general election comes, then they work together and have good applications to get the data information.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go. So we started to speak about legislation. So we speak about Europe. There is the PSI, Public Sector Information Legislation. We have a lot of standards that we're going. And I think pretty much we decided we have pretty much good laws. The problem was not with the laws themselves, was the implementation. Is PDF is enough to call freedom of information, for example. what is equality? How do we actually enforce people to do it? So it's not only the legislation, but how we make it a step further. And because this group was so great to discuss about all this use and measurement and working together all the time, so we thought to ourselves that we need to have some kind of a way to share stories about good data and open data stories. How we can create this kind of space and this topic to actually share and learn from one another, maybe also from mistakes. And maybe how we can use this OGP as a platform to do that when it comes to legislation and other topics. And also, just a thought, if you're supposed to be the best in FOI, do we actually know what we're asking for in these terms? What are the questions that we need to look at? So I actually go from here also for use, so we have the use itself, but can we actually reuse it when we get in FOI? Do we actually know what we can do with the data legally? And another question is, both with FOI and open data, do we actually know how people use the data, so we can actually have better feedback loops, so we can actually get better data. And lastly, do we actually know what is the quality of data we need? And that's come also from measurements. Do we know what we define? Do we know how to look at the quality of data? Are we already there so we can look at the quality of data or not? And looking at FOI specifically, we don't have a lot of ways of looking at it, and we don't have efforts there. So maybe before we think about how to measure them together, we need to see how we create for both of them a way that we can actually look at them apart. But in a really good way also. What Helen said is also about can I get it in a proactive way? Can I get it in an FOI? Can I not get it at all? This is a really important question when we think about that on a global level. So then we come here, for example, so what is important to measure? And we were, Latin group, you don't listen to me, I'm gonna bring you as an example. Thank you for bringing it up. So we were thinking about what we're missing in terms of collaboration. So looking at the European compared to these great guys here in Latam, they have basically a place where they speak about openness in Upper Latam. So it can be open data, it can be FOI, they speak about it, but they come and visiting one another. And in Europe, we don't do that a lot face to face, and maybe this is one of the keys that we need to check if it actually works in order to create better network and less mailing lists for Helen to look at.
Yeah, too many.
So how can we make a better way of networking and getting things together? Did I miss anything here, guys?
I think it's good for now. Very good. Thanks, fantastic.
Thank you, Mark.
So, in the Africa group, we noted that there are 17 countries with freedom of information legislations, and 31 countries were covered by the Open Data Barometer 2014, and out of these, 11 had freedom of information legislations. So the general point to note was that the rate of adoption of freedom of information legislation has increased, with 12 legislations being adopted in the last 5 years. We noted a general lack of implementation, either because of lack of political will or limited capacities to implement these legislations. Now, on measurement, we noted that there is lack of evidence of systematic assessment of impact of transparency on accountability and service delivery. We also noted that no systematic data on application of freedom of information laws and open data initiatives. We noted that in some countries there were some limited, isolated processes to monitor application in particular sectors like PPDC in Nigeria for public contracting and media rights agenda on general FY implementation. On the issue of dialogue between the two communities, FY advocates and open data, we noted that in some instances there are overlaps. We also noted that in a number of, or most of the time, the relationship between governments and open data colleagues, the relationship seems to be cordial, while with freedom of information activists, there is some many times tension. What has been recognized in a number of countries, for example in Kenya and Ghana, is that open data activists or actors have highlighted that a lot of data would be needed, but it is not disclosed, and when disclosed, it is in formats that are not easy to use. And we noted that this is very important because then it can be a point of interaction between FOI advocates and open data. Recommendations, we recommend that there should be need for focused efforts to increase adoption and implementation of laws in Africa, and where these laws exist, there should be more requirements for standards for disclosure. Also need for awareness raising, capacity building for implementation, research on the impact of transparency on accountability and service delivery, the need for standards for measurement, especially implementation of laws, and then agreement between the two communities who think that they can work together on agreeing on standards for disclosure and privacy. And then we also thought that there could be some joint action to influence the content of OGP national action plans. Thank you.
Thank you.
Me and your tea, your coffee, great. So, so we talk as we also, well, in terms of legislation, I think actually, because I couldn't validate this, but I think we are witnesses the rise of a new agenda. In Latin America, there are still areas where we don't know what happens because laws are not in place, or because we actually don't have access to this information because laws were not progressive enough when they were enacted. There's also an issue with enforcement institutions in place. That seems to be the most relevant problem in terms of legislation. And also, of course, most of the participants agreed on the inclusion of open data clauses or open data articles in this law, so essentially to foster a common front in order to reform access to information laws. I mean, there are other issues that actually need to be addressed in terms of reform, but bottom line is that there is a common front for reform, and that seems to be quite obvious. I mean, beyond the inter-American standard or whatever, there are issues that we need to push forward from a legal perspective, and that's there. The second topic is about implementation, and yeah, here there was a lot of discussion, of course, about the state capacity and infrastructure, and most notably archives. Archives are usually under-resourced and stuff like that. But most of the conversation was around the specific use of public information and the social value or the social use of public information. And as a result, we saw that two issues are crucial. The link of this agenda with the specific sectors, I'm just taking my time. Specific sectors and also intermediaries. So we need to engage with intermediaries. You all people working in transparency are generalists, but you don't have a clue of whatever happens in whatever sector. And I think it's very humbling to know that. The other issue is about measurement. We think that the legal approach, we need to supersede the legal approach. I mean, it's good to have it as a sort of a north, but we need to engage in setting up indicators of use, active transparency in specific sectors, and also about performance of enforcement institutions. I mean, it's not only nice to have one, you need to know how it actually performs. So that's another topic. And finally, in terms of connection, I mean, there has to be openness on both sides, but the intersection, at least in this side of the world, is around human rights and open data. So notice that the open data community is broader, and this community, at least this community, seems to be more focused on human rights issues because that's where they come from. So that is naturally the point where these communities could work and move forward stuff in Latin America. I mean, it's not the whole open data community, but it's the community that intersects with this group here. That's us. Thank you.